So where did our great bard have his beginnings? In the Holy Trinity Church at Stratford-upon-Avon. William Shakespeare was baptized on April 26, 1564. We can only guess at his birth date, likely only days before his baptism, since it was customary to baptize a child soon after his birth. We like to imagine that Shakespeare was born on April 23rd, because it's also believed that he died on an April 23rd, years later. But we really don't know when Shakespeare was born. We do know that he was the son of John Shakespeare, who was a tanner, glove maker, and a trader in wool and grain, and Mary Arden, who was the daughter of a substantial landowner. John Shakespeare was later elected to several municipal offices, serving as an alderman, who was a high-ranking member of the council, a bailiff, and the mayor of the town council. Shakespeare thus was the son of an upper-middle-class family. Shakespeare was the third child and the eldest son. Joan, the eldest child, died sometime between her birth in 1558 and 1569. Margaret, the second child, died in her infancy in 1562. Thus, Shakespeare grew up as the eldest of brothers Gilbert, Edmund, and Richard, and another sister named Joan after the eldest who had died, and a younger sister, Anne, who had died at the age of 7. As the son of a prominent city official and a land-owning family, Shakespeare certainly received a thorough education at Stratford's King Edward VI's Grammar School. In the summer, the school day began at about 6 a.m. In the winter, as a concession to the darkness, it began around 7 a.m. At around 11 came a brief recess for lunch, after which school continued, all the way through to about 5:30 or 6 p.m. No Saturdays or summers off. No, this was school 6 days a week. Only religious holidays were observed, and school was not held on those days. So think about this. 6 days a week, 12 months a year, from around 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, Shakespeare received substantial training in Latin, rhetoric, and classical literature, including the plays of Plautus, Terence, and Seneca. No history, no biology or chemistry or physics, no economics or sociology, only a smattering of arithmetic. Instruction required intense memorization, relentless drills, endless repetition, daily analysis of texts, and elaborate exercises in imitation and rhetorical variation, all backed up, of course, with the threat of violence. The schoolmasters literally beat Latin and rhetoric into these boys. The schoolmasters also agreed that one of the best ways to instill good Latin was to have their students read and perform the ancient plays, especially the comedies of Terence and Plautus. Thus, theater was an early means of education for young William. We don't know much of anything else about his boyhood, but in November 1582, when William Shakespeare was only 18 years old, a license was issued for his marriage to Anne Hathaway, 26 years old. She was 8 years his senior. Now, very few young, unmarried Elizabethan women had executive control over their own lives, but Anne, an orphan with resources left by her father's will and more to come upon marriage, was free to make her own decisions. Then, as now, 18 years old was regarded as very young for a man to marry. The average age for males in Stratford marrying in the year 1600, for example, now this is the earliest date for which we have reliable figures, was 28 years of age. William was 18. It was also unusual for a man to marry a woman so much his senior. Women in this period were on average 2 years younger than their husbands. Anne was 8 years older than William. Most likely the Shakespeare family did not approve of the marriage, which at such a young age meant that there were going to be fewer opportunities for young Will. It meant no university education. Also, William's family leaned toward Catholicism, and Anne's family almost certainly leaned towards Protestantism. So why did Shakespeare marry so young and to a woman so much his senior? Well, the answer is in the birth of their daughter, Susanna, who came along 6 months after their marriage. Now, 2 years later, Anne bore William twins, Hamnet and Judith. Now that's Hamnet, not Hamlet. Hamnet and Judith, both born in February 1585. Hamnet, Shakespeare's only son, died at the age of 11. Neither of Shakespeare's daughters produced an heir to continue the Shakespeare lineage. Shakespeare's family still clung to the old faith, Catholicism. Religious strife had torn the country apart, and the Shakespeares were very careful religious dissenters. Within living memory, from 1521 to 1558, this is a 37-year span of time, England had gone from a very highly conservative Roman Catholicism to a kind of tentative Protestantism, to a more radical Protestantism, to a renewed and militant Roman Catholicism, and then back to Protestantism in 37 years. In none of the Tudor regimes was there any vision of religious tolerance. Each shift was accompanied by waves of conspiracy and persecution. Shakespeare was raised amid this religious turmoil, and it was still uncertain what the future held for the state's religion. Quietly, his family remained religious outsiders. How or why Shakespeare made his way into London after his marriage is uncertain. Most likely he moved to London in order to earn money for his young family, since Stratford-upon-Avon had limited economic opportunities. By the time he was 20 years old, Shakespeare had 3 children, no vocation, no university education, and few, if any, opportunities. London was the place to go to carve out a future. Whatever his reasons, Shakespeare moved to London, and for most of his married life lived in London, while Anne and his 3 children remained in Stratford, over 102 miles away. Since Anne could not read, as most women at this time could not, any letter sent to her from London would have to have been read by a male neighbor or friend, and anything she wished to tell her husband would have had to be consigned to a messenger. This obviously put a strain on their relationship. We do not know how Shakespeare managed to find his way into a theatrical career in London, but in 1592, thanks to Robert Greene, who some argue was the first professional author in England, we have our first contemporary reference to William Shakespeare, and it's a snarling one. Robert Greene remarks, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johann Factotum," meaning a jack of all trades, "is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." That Shakespeare, considered at the time as an upstart or a beginner, was drawing this kind of venomous envy from a very well-established writer suggests that he was highly successful early in his career. Since his mother's inheritance had been mortgaged and forfeited by his father's incompetence, and since he had married a woman of modest means, Shakespeare made his fortune almost entirely on his own. In 1594, Shakespeare was a charter member of a theatrical company called the Chamberlain's Men, already performing at court. In 1599, Shakespeare became a sharer in the receipts of the Globe Theatre. In 1603, the Chamberlain's Men became the Royal Company, the King's Men, making Shakespeare the King's playwright. And in 1608, Shakespeare became a sharer in the receipts of the Second Blackfriars Theatre. It was usually in Shakespeare's and in his company's best interest not to have his plays printed. That way, rival companies couldn't stage them and take away business from the rightful owners. Keep in mind, there were no copyright laws at this time. When William Shakespeare died in 1616, therefore, only about half of his plays had ever been printed, in small one-play editions called quartos. This speaks to the popularity of Shakespeare's plays. If the playwright and the company do not want the plays printed, and yet half of them already are, this is due to his popularity and the desire to copy down his work. Some of the quarto texts closely match the wording of the same play in later quartos and in the first folio, but others vary drastically, offering different early versions of the same play. Some plays, such as Richard III, or Henry IV Part 1, and of course Hamlet, appeared in multiple quarto editions, showing their immense popularity. A quarto was about 7 by 9 inches in size. Another 18 plays are known today only because they are included in the 1623 First Folio, collected by John Hemmings and Henry Condell, two senior members of Shakespeare's company who had worked with Shakespeare for about 20 years. This was the first collected edition of the plays, now referred to as the First Folio. A folio was about 9 by 14 inches in size. The 1623 folio divided Shakespeare's plays into comedies, histories, and tragedies. It's important to note that the histories were no more historically accurate than his tragedies, tragedies that included, for example, Julius Caesar and Macbeth, both based on actual historical figures. However, his friends put those plays which were based on English historical figures into the category of histories. Some modern-day editors have created a fourth category, romances, but this category did not exist within the First Folio. We should also note that of Shakespeare's plays, Henry VIII, which was included in the First Folio, is now believed to have been a collaboration written by both William Shakespeare and John Fletcher. Of Shakespeare's works not included in the First Folio, we have Pericles, written, we believe, between 1607 and 1608. This is attributed to Shakespeare. Cardenio, co-authored by Shakespeare and Fletcher, but this play is now lost. And The Two Noble Kinsmen, also co-authored by Shakespeare and Fletcher in 1613. If we include these last three plays, that makes Shakespeare's plays total 39. This class is then a very brief introduction to the great works of William Shakespeare. We're not going to read 39 plays. In the quartos, there were no divisions for acts or scenes. By the time the folio arrived in 1623, however, printing houses were following the Latin convention of marking acts and scenes. Thus, many of the folio plays were forced into a 5-act straitjacket for which they were never intended. Hemmings and Condell, who collected the 36 plays into the First Folio, suggest in an address to the great variety of readers that the republished plays in the 1623 folio are presented in better form than in the quartos, cured and perfect of their limbs, and all the rest absolute in their numbers, in other words, in their meter, as he, meaning Shakespeare, conceived them. End quote. Well, for instance, if one compares the Hamlet that appears in the first quarto, printed in 1603, to the Hamlet that appears in the First Folio, printed in 1623, 20 years later, the differences are remarkable, almost comedic. In the first quarto, Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy is hardly recognizable. A second quarto of Hamlet was also published around 1604-1605, 19 years before the First Folio. It includes around 230 lines not found in the First Folio. However, the First Folio includes roughly 70 lines not found in the second quarto, and has more numerous and fuller stage directions. Therefore, editors often draw on multiple sources, not just the First Folio, when printing Shakespeare's plays. It's very possible that class members' texts will vary, and our line numbers will not always add up. Shakespeare seems to have chosen to retire from the London stage sometime around 1612. The reasons are unknown. He was still in his late 40s, and even at a time when life expectancy was short, Shakespeare was considered to have several years ahead of him. His own father died in his 60s. Nonetheless, Shakespeare must have felt secure enough in his wealth that he returned to Stratford to live at New Place with his wife. But Shakespeare couldn't give it all up. Although he moved back to Stratford, he continued to work and communicate with his friends in London. In collaboration with John Fletcher, whom Shakespeare seems to have handpicked as his successor for the Kingsmen, Shakespeare continued to work. He would die, however, only a few years later, in April 1616, at the age of 52. The details of Shakespeare's death are sketchy. What we do know is that Shakespeare was buried on April 25th, 1616, 2 days after St. George's Day, which is conventionally regarded as the date of Shakespeare's birth and death, April 23rd. Shakespeare was buried within the chancel of the Holy Trinity Church at Stratford, where he had been baptized. His tomb, which lies beneath the floor of the church inside the chancel rail today, is covered by a stone inscribed with these lines: "Good friends, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." And there his bones have remained to this day.